Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the third and final breakout session of the day. And I'm pleased to introduce to you Sam Pickles, who will be our speaker. He's talking about driving cybersecurity excellence in e-government and protecting Delaware's critical systems. Sam is a security veteran with 23 plus years of experience. He specializes in constructing robust defensive systems for critical applications. He's served clients globally in government, finance, healthcare, and other sectors. He holds numerous patents, and he is the technical founder of Red Shield and an alumnus of Stanford, Oxford, and Otago universities. That's pretty impressive right there. And he's delivered presentations at renowned conferences, and he's made appearances on TV and podcasts, including AT&T, Tag Cyber, CIO Live, and TV3 News Hub. Please welcome Sam Pickles.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So thanks everybody for coming. So I'm Sam Pickles. I'm the CTO and founder of Red Shield. I'm a New Zealander, so this is not a speech impediment. Hopefully you can understand me okay. So the topic I wanted to talk to today, so this is relevant really for certainly for government, but also for non-government as well. Services that we provide to the state of Delaware. We're seeing some pretty unusual things happening and some changes going on in the risk landscape, which I'll talk to, a lot of which is relevant to the corporate sector and enterprise as well, and a lot of parallels between what we see in Delaware government and also what we see in other governments worldwide. So I'll talk a little to that, and I've got an approximate breakdown here. We'll spend a little more time on risk landscape and how I see that changing going forward into 2024, and then how we're changing the game with effective mitigation. So I'll talk to some of the things which we're doing, and these are strategies that you might use in your own organizations as well, and some of the things that we've learnt in rolling out mitigations to help organizations handle the risk. Okay, so by way of background, so we're a services company which finds and fixes web application vulnerabilities. So if you imagine websites, critical systems like online government, online banking, we'll sit in front of those types of sites and we'll find and fix web application vulnerabilities. And a vulnerability is just some kind of weakness which would enable an attacker to be able to breach or do something bad to a system. And typically you would need to use developers to fix things like this. So you get security testers, and they'll test all of your applications, find lists of problems, and then you provide those to your developer teams, and they'll work through them as quickly as they can. But the reality is that takes quite a long time. It's difficult and expensive and slow fixing a lot of web applications. And if you take the case of, let's say, a government agency that might have 800 websites or more, probably only 4 or 5 teams of developers, it's very difficult to stay across all of those security upgrades all of the time. And the program that we provide rolls out security controls in front of those critical websites so that we can take a lot of the pressure off the developer teams. We're much, much faster and less expensive than internal dev teams, which is generally the reason to use us. So just to give you a bit of an idea broadly about how this looks globally. So there's something like 12.5 billion transactions running through our platform a month, and that's a person with a website accessing, with a browser rather, accessing a website. We're performing over 100 trillion security checks on those, and of that, about 40 million of them we deem to be something nefarious, and we'll block them. And across all of our customers, there's about 80,000 vulnerabilities under management. So under management means we've taken some sort of weakness in the software and we've deployed some code on a proxy and which has mitigated that, so it's no longer exploitable and saved the customer from needing to do that dev work. This wheel over here, I don't expect everyone to study in detail, but that's a depiction of some of the service processes that wrap around this. So there's a lot of incident response and running vulnerability scanners and tuning security controls. All of those things are repeatable service processes that we run alongside the platform itself. So just to give you an idea of how this looks architecturally. So this slide is a little bit busy, but I'll just talk you through what we've got here. So at the back here, we've got a website, basically. This is some system sitting on some servers. And then in the middle here, we've got a couple of layers, which there's this one here, which is labeled AWS. There's a lot of things like DDoS mitigation. So their denial of service is a pretty major concern. I'll talk a little bit about some of the denial of service attacks that we're seeing and mitigating here at this layer. And then in the middle is the smarter stuff. So this is the dealing with the more complex problems that you find in websites, things like implementing multi-factor authentication and some of the smarter things that we do, which is a little closer to the app. The obligatory logo slide. So probably the main thing here is just around partners. So there's from AT&T, AWS, Deloitte. We sell services through all of these organizations, and we hold a number of compliance certifications as well, which will help you understand whether or not you could deal with us. Okay, so with that out the way, let's take a look at the risk landscape. What do we see over the last 12 months, and what do we see going forward into 2024? Certainly with the Ukraine conflict, there's been a few changes I hear in the risk landscape, people talking about. The things that we have direct experience of really here are around Russian nationalists and sympathizers who are threatening Ukrainian allies. Any nation which has seen offering support for Ukraine, and that includes that includes a couple of governments that we work for, including our home government of New Zealand and certainly state government that we work for here as well. So we've seen there's groups like No Name 057, Killnet, Anonymous Sudan that have got various names that they group themselves under, but they're conducting denial of service attacks and attempting to kind of rattle the cages. A lot of this, I think, is actually some of these groups are trying to, particularly Killnet, I think, we're trying to become kind of something like a cyber Wagner group, trying to curry favour with Putin and demonstrate how cyber offensive methods could be used to strike fear into Russia's enemies. So with varying success, I think they managed to take down a few websites and things, relatively inconsequential. But we did see, quite interestingly though, one thing that we have seen is that the attacks have become a lot larger than what we'd seen in previous years. So we saw one of our government properties that we're protecting was attacked on approximately every 24-hour basis throughout the day and night. And then it culminated in just about a 2.5 terabit per second attack, which if any network folks in the room will recognise, that's a very, very large attack. And that we're expecting to see that the attack sizes coming into 2024 are likely to continue jumping in size. So it's necessary in this case to have an extremely large scale infrastructure sitting in front of that. It's very unlikely that you can handle this just with traditional data center firewalls, and even with a lot of bandwidth, this is just way, way more than really the average data center could handle. I'll give you a sense of how big this is. So on this website, you'd typically have 100 people that would be using the site, and then on a very busy day, you might have 1,000 people. So that's a picture of 1,000 people. And then, so here's our 1,000 people again, shrunk down. And a typical DDoS, you might have 100,000, equivalent of about 100,000 people hitting the site. So just to, I guess, to give you an idea, so this is 100,000 people here. Philadelphia Stadium would hold 67,000, so about 2/3 of that number. So we're talking about the equivalent of that many people all kind of hitting the website at the same time. And what we're seeing here, so that little number, this little block down here is 100,000, and now we're talking almost 350 million people. So the size of the attack that we saw there is equivalent to most of the people in the United States all hitting the site at the same time. Extremely difficult to defend that much volume of traffic without, there are probably fewer and fewer systems on the planet that can really soak up that much traffic. In this case, obviously, we've got the system that we've built in partnership with AWS, and infrastructure on that kind of scale is really increasingly needed in order to prevent attacks like this from succeeding. So in this case, we were able to soak it up. It's no problem. The website kept on running, but it was just an absolutely eye-watering number, which raised eyebrows across a couple of government customers that we've discussed this with. What we're seeing though in terms of, so denial of service is one thing. It'll cause embarrassment. You can bring websites down. You can maybe create some headlines. Data breaches are significantly worse, where data actually gets stolen, and there's a much more lasting effect to that. So in the case of a corporation, we've had breaches which have resulted in CEOs needing to resign, and we've had stock prices affected, and it tends to be much more impactful than simple denial of service. So generally, to be treated, I think, as more important. 62% of breaches at the moment are now involving web applications. So this has jumped up from the previous year's numbers. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that it's taking, on average, 246 days for developer teams to fix vulnerabilities. So that means after you discover some weakness, let's say you find out that you can walk straight past the login page and access another user's data, some sort of problem like that gets discovered, and it's taking on average 246 days to get that fixed. So it means that most organizations within a 12-month period are only really remediating half of their new vulnerabilities, which is not a brilliant statistic. And ultimately it comes down to this: you've got 1.8 billion websites in the world, but there's only 27 million developers. There just aren't enough developers to stay across all of the sites all the time. If we look a little deeper, so web application breaches, I'll show why I believe this reinforces the need for MFA, and there's a lot of organizations like CISA saying that MFA is really the most important focus right now. I'll show why that is, but so here's our 62% there. There's also breaches due to email, carelessness, and other types of causes there. So we can see that web applications is pretty high up there. This data comes from Verizon. This is their breach report from this year, with about 3,200 breaches. The motivations here are almost entirely financial. It's 97% just people trying to make money, and breaching web apps is one way that they can do it, and that usually then eventually leads to a ransomware attack by breaching the web app and stealing credentials, and a couple of steps later you can monetize these attacks. But there's other ways as well, just outright theft of data, stealing of accounts, selling healthcare records, all of those other ways that criminals will make money from stolen data is all quite relevant here as well. So let's have a look at, okay, web apps are getting breached. How is that happening? Use of stolen creds. So there are databases out on the dark web that have lists of stolen passwords. If you get hold of those, they're quite easy to get hold of, and you run them against a website, you'll typically find a lot of those stolen credentials will work because users will tend to use passwords across multiple sites. So that's really what drives it. And that's the reason why use of stolen creds is absolutely dominating these stats. And then you've got exploit vulnerability. So this is, you'll remember Log4Shell, which was December a couple of years ago. That has caused an uptick actually, and this graph here keeps going up. The stat ends on 2021, so the following year it goes a little higher. So vulnerability exploitation is certainly important, but this use of stolen creds here, again, this is reinforcing the fact that there's different ways that you could look at resolving this, and I'll look at a couple of options, but I think they've got some pretty serious challenges with them, and it really just pushes us towards MFA. So I'll demonstrate some ways in which we're addressing that. So login forms are quite soft targets for stolen creds and brute force. So we think they should be a priority for security teams to protect. By their nature, they're quite easy to discover. They're very visible on the web, and you can just search for them. Most apps don't have multi-factor auth. Most also won't prevent users from registering with a weak or stolen password. And certainly, I think particularly reusing creds that have been used on other websites is a difficult thing actually to stop. And also most apps don't prevent excessive automated login requests, and you've got these widespread availability of stolen credential lists on the dark web, so it makes it quite easy and cost effective for attackers to breach web apps. And we're certainly seeing an increase, certainly year on year, the number of bots that are just crawling the internet and continually stuffing credentials into logging pages. So credential stuffing is the generic name for that type of attack, is rising continuously. If we have a look at where it's actually coming from, not completely to pick on Russia, so there's a lot of traffic that does come out of Russia. That's not to say that this is necessarily Russian nationals who are doing this. It may not be the Russian government, it may not even be Russian organised crime. However, here's a Russian network, and there's a lot of them, which have very poor reputation in terms of their known spammers, and there's a lot of attack traffic coming out of them. Just continuously vulnerability scanning, particularly our government web properties. I think they get it worse than most. Maybe the finance sector would be similar. With brute force attempts, so brute force being just continuously guessing and trying to penetrate by guessing passwords. So this one here, this is Changwei Technologies, which doesn't seem to have a website or any services that I can tell. Registered in Hong Kong, owns this network in Moscow, and if you search on this address here, this that MW Tower, Bonham Strand, this is linked to many other companies via the Paradise Papers. So a lot of these shell companies that own these networks are implicated in what could be organised crime, but certainly shell companies, and it would be consistent with how organised crime would set up a network. It may be that the Russian government does it this way, but I'm thinking that this is more just organised hacking groups. And this one in particular is a command and control network. They've got a large number of fake websites which move around and host names changing constantly. So that's one of the networks which has been attacking us, one of millions of IPs that are attacking us. If we have a look at this one, so this is pretty similar sort of pattern. You've got here another network hosted in Moscow, poor reputation, and just continuously attempting to penetrate systems globally. Actually, we've seen this attacking multiple governments, so they're pretty active. This is owned by a Panamanian co-location company, so this is a hosting company, which on their website says they have a strong commitment to privacy. So basically what that means is bring your criminal enterprise, host it on our co-location facility, and we won't tell tales. So it's really an invitation to kind of do whatever you want. There's this guy here, Carlos Alberto Wiand Ortiz. So this guy here, if that is a real person, there's his Instagram. He is an officer of 3,900 other companies. So kind of difficult structures to, they're hard to subpoena, they're hard to even contact at all. If you send them a cease and desist, they just ignore it. They're basically just a well enough protected front. This guy, Carlos, if he's a real person, he probably has absolutely no idea what this organisation's doing. But reasonably well sort of hidden. So that would be typical of what we're seeing out of Moscow. We're also seeing so APTs, you're probably familiar with this term, Advanced Persistent Threat. There's APT groups which are implicated in these attacks that we're blocking. Sometimes attribution can be hard, but what we'll do is we'll look at the techniques that are being used, see what types of vulnerabilities that they're trying to exploit, and then from that we can actually infer who the group might be. And the data as to how we correlate that is published by MITRE, which is research sponsored by Department of Homeland Security, and they'll provide us with information on if we see this type of technique, it may relate to this group. So again, it's not often conclusive, but it tends to be, there's a lot of Chinese state-sponsored espionage. There's also a lot of outright cybercrime, and this group, Carbonac, I think, don't seem to be geographically affiliated. They're more just a loose collective. And Muddy Water, which is more Iranian. So seems to be a lot of China, Russia, Iran, and that'll probably come as no surprise to most. Okay, there's something I wanted to just talk about briefly is IP addresses. And actually, I think IP addresses are getting more and more challenging as a way to block bad things from happening. And one reason for that is you'll be probably familiar with these anonymizing proxy networks. So you can have something called a VPN. So outside the US, a lot of home users would use a VPN to appear that they're coming from inside the US in order to access US TV, Netflix, Amazon Prime. That type of industry has kind of been used to anonymize a lot of attack traffic. And so this organization here is offering 75 million IP addresses, all of which are in residential ISP space. So from your firewall logs, what you're seeing here is basically home broadband users, but they're being used as a relay by anyone who wants to hook into them. And you can get as many addresses as you like, and you can just keep on rotating them. They're quite cheap. So IP reputation, geographic blocking, IP thresholding and banning, session tracking, rate limiting, firewalling, IP reputation lists are all becoming less effective over time. And for your more skilled adversaries, it's really trivial to set this up. So For the people who really matter, which are likely to steal information from you in a particularly bad way, those types of controls, I think, are becoming less effective. And it seems to be that it used to be that a lot of this attack traffic was coming from Tor, from the Onion router, which a lot of people will be familiar with. It's a strong anonymizing network where if you come through Tor, it's very difficult or almost impossible unless you're a few government organizations. It's impossible to tell where the person's coming from. These anonymizing networks are nowhere near as secure as that. They're really just a pretty thin layer, but it seems to be enough. And mostly where these cyber criminals are operating from, they're not actually afraid of local law enforcement. So they're not really trying to hide from their own police to avoid jail time. They don't really care about getting discovered for the most part. Mostly what we're doing there is just trying to switch IP addresses rapidly just to avoid being blocked so that they can just get on with what they're doing. AI-powered capture services. So a year ago, it's been an unbelievable year in AI. I know AI is super buzzwordy, but let's just have a look at where we've come. So a year ago, the problem with capture, so you'll be familiar with capture, the wobbly letters that you type in to prove that you're a human. You could bypass that by using a capture solving service, which is kind of a sad industry where you send the captures, the attacker will be attacking a website and getting presented with a capture, and they send that off to basically to a sweatshop or a virtual sweatshop of people usually in the third world working for very, very low rates of pay who are just solving captures and allowing the attack to continue. Even that is no longer actually required because all of these types of captures can now be solved by AI systems really cheaply, really quickly. So you no longer actually even need teams of humans. So from what I can see, I think capture's in trouble, and I can't see that improving in a hurry because we're kind of at the stage where AI is solving capture now more effectively than humans. So if you make them more difficult, then your users are going to really struggle with them and it's going to impact your usability of your site. So we've got a bit of an issue with capture. I think we'll probably see that diminishing as a useful tool. Now, I just wanted to talk quite briefly about phishing kits. So phishing, as you're no doubt aware, phishing is the art of tricking people into clicking on links. Have a look at this kind of domain. So this would give you an idea. So if the average user looking at this link would believe that they're going to yourdomain.com, but in actual fact, what you're going to is ke6wl.co. So it's, instead of a slash at the end there, we've just got a dot. So they're often, this is super easy to set up and quite hard for a lot of users don't really notice this, even if they're trying to be quite vigilant. There's a server here called EvilGenX, and this is Nginx is a popular web server reverse proxy, which you can get a copy of this, which is designed. It's intended for security researchers, but it's easily co-opted for nefarious purposes. This is basically a proxy that sits in the middle of the phished user and the victim website, or I suppose they're both the website and the user are both victims here. But it means that a lot of the kind of mitigation schemes here that you can come up with that run on a website can all be changed by this evil server, so you can't really trust anything which reaches the user's browser. Mitigating this kind of stuff, bot mitigation used to be really simple because the early bots were just standalone scripts, and they'd run a script and they're trying to scrape a website or trying to guess a password, that kind of thing. You just send back a JavaScript, so you send back a basic test to say, are you a robot or are you a real browser? And it was pretty easy because your basic script would fail and you could block them and the browser would pass and you'd allow them in. What's changed though is that newer bots are actually made out of browsers, and so you get this. So here's this example. It's a system called Puppeteer, which is a way to script headless Chrome, which is a browser. So you can get all this running on your bot, and this will respond in exactly the same way as a real browser, which is quite easy to set up. So what it means is that these kind of bot detector technologies are really kind of in trouble too, because they're throwing back these tests to see if it's a real browser or a robot, and can no longer really tell the difference. Now that bot detection technology is quite a lot smarter than just what I've described. It'll also do a lot of other fingerprinting It'll look at IP reputation, which, as we've talked about, is a bit challenging. Client-side JavaScript sensors, so looking to see whether the mouse is moving and whether it's a realistic window size and all those kinds of things. Problem is that they're all really easy to fake, and so if you get this kind of bot technology, I'll talk just really briefly about some testing that we've done on this. It would be really good if this did work, but we're struggling to see in the long run actually how this is going to continue working, because bots are getting smarter and more human identical. So all of the sensor information is under the control of the adversary. So that's everything on the bot side. They can pretend to be whatever you ask for. So you can see, is the mouse movement realistic for a left or right hander? Look for all of these sort of I guess indicators of real human activity, but all of those can just quite easily be spoofed. And the reality is also that if you tune that bot mitigation technology too tightly, it causes false positives. So real humans get blocked by accident, and then the business makes you switch it off. So we had a bank that was running an online banking website that had an industry-leading anti-bot mitigation technology sitting in front of it, and we did some testing work for them to see if it was effective. And we also set up another couple of competitive vendors as well, just to do a benchmarking assessment on this. And we found that in reality, the way that this is actually deployed in production, that all we really had to do was a little bit of randomized mouse movement, not even clever mouse movement that looks like a left or right-handed person or anything to that degree at all. Just a little bit of randomized mouse movements and some random wait times, all we had to do. And we could just guess passwords on this application all day long. So it turns out in practice, I think the bot mitigation vendors would say, okay, in that case, we try a bit harder, we switch on some more things. But the reality is that I found in working with them, we've asked them to do that, and we've found that we can still walk through them. So our experience has been that I think that bot mitigation is looking like, I think in the long run, some researchers would believe that it won't succeed, that actually bots are going to be able to fool it in the long run in ways which can't be detected. So that view is controversial. The vendors would disagree with me on that, but it's certainly it's a belief that we've sort of formed through our own testing. So because the bots are becoming increasingly human identical, what that really means is that we're kind of security policymakers and insurance providers are increasingly mandating the use of multi-factor authentication. It's what we've got left as being an effective control. So if we're looking at integrating MFA into the login flow for web apps, without overburdening overbusy developer teams, rolling this out as a program across dozens and hundreds of sites is quite challenging in terms of how do you do this in a practical way. So I'll talk a little about how we're doing this in a way that you might choose to do the same thing. CISA obviously can't put it more strongly, so no doubt you'll be familiar with the Cyber Defence Agency, CISA, and this statement here, most are taking advantage of unpatched vulnerabilities, poor hygiene, or the failure to implement critical technologies like MFA, and sadly, too few organisations learn how valuable MFA is until they experience a breach. So I think it's a pretty strong statement, and we're seeing CISA increasingly banging the drum on multi-factor authentication. So let's look at some ways that you can do that. There's a method of doing this called FIDO2 or WebAuthn, which is the protocol that you would use for driving authentication using strong security keys. So this is an AI-generated image of a key, just to avoid using a real vendor image. That's not an actual security key, but you get what I'm talking about. They've got some drawbacks. Now these are really good. They're really strong. We use them ourselves through our VPN, and they're excellent for staff, for relatively small groups of users. But you've got the drawback of logistics. You've got to post them out. People lose them. You have to reset them. They're expensive. And actually, the user and key lifecycle management turns out to be the weakest part. So calling the help desk and saying, I've lost my key, I need you to reset it for me, can lead to a breach. And that's really what happened with MGM. And so they kind of, arguably, they may fall back to the security of email and support tickets and social engineering of your help desk. rather than just the cryptographic security of the key itself, which is very, very strong. It's more the human kind of process around this. There's a relatively new idea here called passkeys as a replacement for passwords, which are great. They're really promising for devices that the user exclusively controls. So there are some challenges where you've got, particularly in government, if you're serving marginalised communities, you've got people that are using computers at the library, you've got families that share one smartphone. So it is difficult in that case to tie the identity of the person to the device. So there are some drawbacks to that. Having said that though, passkeys are certainly very promising. So you'll certainly see more of that. I think it is due to become, if it isn't already, the default method for logging into Google. So you'll certainly become more familiar with those over time. But yeah, they're not yet really suitable for mandating. So they can only be used as an option, which means that you still need to support other methods as well. What we found as a bit of a sweet spot here is a system called email magic link. So magic link is not our words. I get nervous when I see the words magic with anything to do with security. But what you've got here is you log into the site. So this is, you also see this called passwordless. And passwordless might mean many things. It could be those hardware tokens. It could be this. It could be passkeys. Anything that doesn't involve a password. And there's a few ways now that you can do password-free authentication. And email magic link is certainly one of them. But the reason why this is really good from our standpoint is that we're often required to roll out MFA across a lot of applications without changing the app. So there's no developers to add multi-factor auth to the app. We have to do it sitting in our shielding layer out the front. And so adding an email magic link is a very inexpensive way to do that, because there's no app, there's no token. You don't have to even go through much of a kind of communications process. You don't have to do a big corporate comms and announce the change and guide everybody through it and have a whole lot of help desk calls, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite easy to roll out, really. It's immediately obvious how to use it, and you can do this actually without announcing a change to customers. You just simply display the page saying you need to go and check your email and validate the link. So in that link there, the key to this, to make this phishing resistant, that link has to open a new session, and that becomes the session. That's why it's phishing resistant, because you can't fool somebody into clicking on a link which opens a session to the evil website, which is then able to access the app. You're able to prevent that from happening. So what you've got here is quite a low-cost, easy-to-roll-out method of solving those problems we were talking about before with credential stuffing and with phishing. So for that reason, we're seeing a lot of customers using this to get across, especially if you think you've got, in a bank, you would have online banking and you'd have wealth management and superannuation funds and those kinds of really flagship applications, but then you'd often have a really long tail of other stuff like booking online leave or requesting stationery, or, you know, there's a big European bank told me they've got 20,000 websites. So, you know, there's clearly a lot of those. They're not big flagship apps. However, you might have things like supplier invoicing portals, and there's a lot of transaction data. There's a lot of pretty important information in those, especially the older systems, which paradoxically they're less secure because they haven't been maintained as well. But they've also that's where all the data is. So so that's what we're thinking when I'm thinking in terms of, you know, your long tail of legacy applications. It's not probably so much the big flagship apps. You can probably just build MFA into the app. But this is for handling everything else, and there's a lot of everything else. Okay, so this no-touch MFA, without getting sort of too salesy on it, I guess come and talk to us on the stand for details on how we do this. But suffice to say that I can certainly vouch for this approach of using email magic link as a way to solve a range of security challenges related to bots. But yeah, in concept, you've got an application server, a proxy sitting at the front. So this flowchart here, the customer's coming in, we'll decide if we need 2FA, and we can send one-time passwords or MFA token generation via SMTP or Twilio. Now you can do this, you could do this using any kind of proxy. You could do this with an F5, you could do it with Nginx, you could do it by writing code in a reverse proxy system. There's lots of ways that you could do this. This is also the approach that we use as well, and the reason why I recommend doing it this way is just that you don't have to rebuild and redeploy the app, and that's often the sticking point, which is hard to do. Okay, one of the other things which I think is relevant to locally here in state is this single sign-on to a state-driven identity provider. So this is the other thing that you can do here is if you've got an app which is vulnerable to various different types of attacks, you can just simply prevent anyone connecting to it until they've been through a trusted authentication process. And this is also can be quite an efficient way to get this done because you do your multi-factor authentication here, you're doing it with Okta or Microsoft or Auth0, or there's lots of other vendors that you can do this with, and then you use this protocol called SAML, and so putting this in front of a legacy website is quite an easy thing to do, and then it pushes the authentication up here to your corporate standard, or in the case of Delaware, there's a citizens identity provider here that you can tap into, and these, what's called a SAML service provider, are quite low cost, and you can get them out in front of the legacy applications. Okay, so this, if you embark on a program of work like this, you'll find some of the challenges that you have. Excluded content, you'd often have pages on the app that you want to just allow access to. Unusual authentication schemes, you'll find things like client certificates and so forth which need to be handled. JavaScript and redirects, so for any web developers, so this is where the server sends back a JavaScript and it makes the page redirect, and that can happen in multiple stages, and you have to handle things like that when you're doing this this kind of SSO stuff in front of the app. Password reset schemes, single page apps as they're called, and server-to-server APIs. So these are all the type of different sort of edge cases that you have to handle, and there's ways to do all of those, but as you embark on a program of work like this, you'll come across all of these. And device trust workflows, step-up authentication where you go to take a privileged action and you have to trigger authentication again, those types of things. And what we're usually required to avoid here is requirements for changing the app or re-engineering, cost of hardware and software tokens, and the logistics of enrollment, all the help desk and communications overhead, doing big kind of public comms about how the app is changing, etc., is really costly, and that can kind of slow things down. So being able to avoid those things is those are some important considerations. Okay, what I've got here, if anybody would like a copy of the slides, that this QR code is a Smartsheet form. If you if you can supply your email address, we'll send out a copy of the slides to you. You can also request, if you want, an attack surface risk report. So that's where we'll search across all of your applications, discover all of the host names, have a look and see which ones are risky. So that's not, it's not to say that we actually vulnerability scan the apps unless you wanted us to. But that's something that we can do at no cost. So if you would like to drop us a line and request a copy of slides and risk report, we'll be very happy to do so. Otherwise, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I might have a couple of minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience?
How is it different from a WAF?
Different to a WAF.
Yeah.
So it includes a WAF, it needs a WAF, and it also needs more. So you would use a WAF for some types of vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. There's some common attack types that you may have heard of there. The WAF is the best solution for those. But then there are other things like your application is missing MFA, or maybe the session tokens are too weak, or you've got users that are registered with weak passwords. Problems like that are too complex to solve with a WAF. And for that, you need to have this reverse proxy, which I showed you, which will sit in the same place as a WAF, but it's more complex in what it does than what a WAF does. So, yeah.
Does this include all the vulnerabilities which are taken care by WAF?
Yes, it does, yeah. And a lot more besides. A WAF is usually, depending on if you're talking about scanner findings or if you're talking about penetration test results, a WAF will be able to take care of maybe half of your scanner findings if you tune it really well. But then there's still the other half, and there's a lot of things like header sanitization and other things that you need to do which WAFs aren't really very well suited to. And then if you look at a penetration test would say things like you've got weak and guessable session tokens, or you've got your session token appears in a GET request and you have to translate it into a POST request. You're really getting much more into what developers would be required to do, and a WAF can't handle those. So in order to run this program, we need WAFs, and we do use them certainly, but we write a lot of code on reverse proxies, and they sit together and they work together to be able to resolve the greatest number of vulnerabilities.
Is this feasible for intranet web apps?
Yes, it is. There's two ways to do that. One is to deploy this as a private capability inside the secured environment, or the other is to actually run traffic out through a web environment and back in again in a locks down way. So that can be done over a private network link, over IPsec, over a VPN. So there's different ways that you can do that. The quickest way by far is to, in our case particularly, is to run it through a cloud service and back in again. But a lot of organizations prefer to have a private enclave built in their own environment, which is reasonably straightforward, but is a bit more to it.
Let's say, you have a QR code like that,
Yeah.
and it's every place now, right? And you're using your smartphone. What is the best way to protect your smartphone from a QR code that's going to a rogue?
An evil QR code.
Yeah.
So a QR code, so effectively it's just a hyperlink, right? It's the same as clicking a link on an email. So could be good, could be bad, exactly like you say. So I think it probably pays to know what QR code you're pointing at. I would definitely agree with that. I think maybe the best advice there is to people using QR codes to just question what it is that you're aiming at and what you're clicking on. And when you go to that website, what is it? Is that what you think it is? So if for example, you might be able to phish somebody by sending them an email saying, hey, this is your bank, you have to urgently go and change your password, something like that. I could also do the same thing by going, hey, this is your bank, here, have a free investment credit, and show you a QR code, and it goes to a fake bank website. So effectively it could be used for a phishing campaign. It could also be used if you've got a 0-day vulnerability to put malware onto your device. Those are all ways in which clicking a QR code could go wrong. So effectively, I think it comes down to exactly like a link in an email, just be clear on what you're clicking on. I think maybe to your point, it's harder to look at that and say, does that go to a phishing site or a real site? I don't know.
You can't hover over it.
Well, when you hover over it, you can see what the actual domain is that it's pointing to.
You can hover
Yeah.
over it as you would with
Yes, yeah,
email.
yeah, you can.
Regular web
Yeah,
messenger.
you just got to watch out for these ones. Where was my little phishing link? This one. Yeah. If you hover over it and you see trusted, trusteddomain.com, and if you're not very vigilant with that, it's pretty easy to still miss it, right?
Well, the nice thing about things like that, you could be trained. You could say, no, there's not a path identifier. It's another domain separator. So.
But you may be getting beyond what the average user will absorb in a training like that. But yeah, you can certainly train users.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.